For the gods gave no warning of their abandonment, neither then did they herald the coming of our salvation. Excerpt from the Prophet of Man, author unknown. John opened his eyes, or at least he thought that's what he did. However, the world around him was just as dark as it was behind his eyelids. He tried to move his arms, and it felt as if he was submerged in water. He was wading through the infinite nothingness of the universe. He caught glimpses of light in the corners of his eyes, but could never focus on them. Memories of his past flickering out just beyond his reach. He tried to speak, to yell, but nothing came out. He saw something else in the corner of his eye. This one didn't flicker away, though. It stayed persistent. He hesitated to look towards it because he didn't want it to vanish like all the others. This one was different. It seemed to glow with a dim brown light, and he could sense movement from it. The light didn't seem to actually illuminate anything around it, however. He finally decided to look. He turned his head to the light in the distance. It didn't fade away. He struggled to focus on it, on its movement. His head began to pound from the strain. John realized that it wasn't just one light, but dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands of smaller lights all swarming together and growing larger. No, they weren't growing larger, they were getting closer, closer to him. He strained his eyes and his mind to try to understand the nature of the thing that was drawing ever nearer, until he wished that he hadn't. What he had mistaken for light before wasn't really light at all, but strange geometric surfaces that reflected light from an unknown source. It looked like a poorly rendered 3D model that was being lit from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Each little object was a complex pattern of vertices and impossible geometry spiraling in on itself and fading into infinity. It was impossible and beautiful and mesmerizing. They pulsed and morphed and changed, spirals of geometric shapes reaching out like little fractal tentacles, swirling through the air in patterns that were reminiscent of Fibonacci spirals. John had never seen something so beautiful or terrifying in his life. His head split with an excruciating migraine as his mind tried to wrap around what he was seeing. He screamed out in pain, but only heard silence as the impossibilities got closer. He could see now that each one of those little shapes were actually much larger than he had originally thought. Each one was nearly the size of his ship, and they were getting closer, fast. The closer they got, the more erratically their shapes and patterns twitched and convulsed in a disturbing display of incomprehensible horror that John couldn't tear his eyes away from. John felt something to his back, a warmth, like he was lying chest down on a beach back on Earth. It brought him comfort at first, but the heat increased exponentially until it felt as if it could melt the flesh right off of his back. The void began to turn a deep red in the corner of his eye. The impossible creatures before him stopped in place, only a few meters away from him. He was wrong. There were thousands of them, maybe even more. He felt tears begin to stream down his face. The pain on his back eventually got so bad that he was able to tear himself away from the things before him and turn around to see it. Larger than the sky itself. It was terrible. He screamed out in horror, and this time his voice found him. John jolted awake, throwing himself forward against the straps that held him to his command throne. Just a dream. It was just a dream. He was awake now, he thought. He still couldn't see anything, but it felt more real, but also less real at the same time. More grounded, anyway.
John, are you all right?
Pine said as an indicator light burst to life on the console before John. That light was real. This was real, wasn't it? I don't know.
We seem to have had a rough landing.
It's called a crash, Pine. We crashed.
Yes, we crashed. I took the liberty of running a quick diagnostic scan while you were thrashing around. All systems that were able to respond are now in critical condition.
Lovely. I feel like I might be in a critical condition myself, John said as he reached up and released the safety straps. There would definitely be bruises, maybe even a few broken or cracked bones after an incident like that. The adrenaline was keeping him going for now.
If you equip your power suit, I can run diagnostics on you too.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. John struggled to his feet. Pine turned on 2 small lights behind him that illuminated a glass cylinder that stood upright, containing his power suit. He painstakingly hobbled his way over to it, almost tripping over a storage container that had fallen out of its security net during the crash. The suit was thin and white, with various black exothermic lines that glowed a bright white when activated, running throughout it and connecting to the shell-shaped life support pack on the back. The helmet was narrow and the face shield flat, similar in appearance to an old welding mask, but obviously far more advanced. It always amused John how many modern technologies seemed to imitate or emulate more ancient ones. He opened the door and began removing the different pieces of the suit and putting them on one by one. The primary jumpsuit went on first, then the boots and gauntlets, then the vest that held the life support shell and most of the other tools and tech that the suit offered. Finally, John picked up the helmet and stared into its shield. He could see his dim reflection staring back at him. He had completely forgotten what he looked like. He wasn't ugly, it just wasn't exactly what he had pictured in his own mind for some reason. The face that looked back at him was square, with a well-defined and clean-shaven jaw, but his nose was slightly crooked and his hairline left a little to be desired, though it was hard to notice since his hair was shaved nearly to nothing in a low military cut. He turned the helmet around, undoing the side clasps and fitting it over his head, placing and ratcheting it down onto the high collar of the vest and suit itself. He heard the faint hiss of air as the suit sealed itself. A small display appeared in the corner of his eye, and light flowed out from his back through the exothermic lines. The control pad attached to the gauntlet on his right wrist sprang to life. He heard Pine's voice coming through the helmet's speakers now, and his gauntlet lit up with a small symbol on its screen, indicating that Pine was communicating.
Running health diagnostics now. Several mild contusions, but nothing serious. Administering painkillers.
John felt a sharp pain from the needle that was jabbed into his back by his suit's life support system. He shook off the pain and then walked towards the small airlock, barely large enough for him, that contained the entry hatch that would open up onto the starboard stabilization wing of the ship.
You may want to equip your force multiplier. We have no idea what is out there.
John looked beside the exit hatch at the small glass cabinet that held a collapsible mag rifle. He opened the small glass door and removed the thin weapon that appeared as a long white rectangle since it had not yet been deployed. He slung it around his shoulder with its strap, and then stepped into the glass airlock cylinder and closed its door behind him. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, John said, taking a deep breath.
Just open the door already,
Pine chided. John glared down at his wrist, then pressed the button to release the door's hatch.
Depressurization in progress,
Pine said over the loud hissing of air being released from the door. The door opened. Light filled the dim cabin of the ship and nearly blinded him. John took a step out on the wing of the ship and took in the sight. What he saw took his breath away. Before him was a beautiful vista, full of trees, mountains, and lakes, surrounded by brilliant orange mesas. It was the most beautiful thing he ever remembered seeing. He stood there motionless for several minutes, watching as a flock of birds that no human had ever seen before flew by him. Life. He had discovered beautifully vibrant life thriving on another planet. He felt a single tear of awe run down his face. Pine cleared his throat.
You might want to check on your ship. This discovery means very little if we can't get back home.
John sighed reluctantly and had to struggle to tear his eyes away from the magnificence before him. I suppose you're right. John turned around and for the first time realized that his ship had perched itself rather precariously right on the edge of an impossibly high cliff. It had been wedged between two massive stone outcroppings that converged together right above it. He took a step towards the series of hand and footholds that would lead over the ship's hull to the other side, but immediately froze as he felt the ship shift under his feet. Fear rose up inside of John.
I have a bad feeling about this,
Pine whispered. Oh, really? I'm personally feeling great, John retorted nervously. He slowly took another step towards the ladder. Nothing. He took another. He was only a few feet away. Another step. His foot slipped, and he fell towards the ladder as the ship groaned its disapproval beneath him and started to list. John's hand barely caught the first handle and frantically scurried up the side of the ship as it continued to capsize. The whole ship began to slide out from its resting place. John reached the other side and began to sprint up the port wing, which was nearly at a 45-degree angle now. He jumped for the tip as the listing ship reached too steep an angle to climb. His hand caught the tip, and he hoisted himself up onto the very edge right as the ship fell. He jumped. A small thruster on his pack detonated, giving him the extra boost he needed to clear the cliff's edge and roll over onto solid ground. He began to hyperventilate as he lay there on his back, his hand still hanging over the edge of the cliff. John forced himself to fearfully turn himself over and look over the edge. He saw a small glint of white tumbling through the air, hundreds of feet below him. It disappeared into the tree covering below, and then detonated in a brilliant fireball that he felt the impact of several seconds later, even from this height. Looking down into the depths caused his head to spin with vertigo, so he rolled back over onto his back.
Well, that was certainly exciting,
his helmet speaker said. He didn't respond.
Got any duct tape?
John continued to hyperventilate.
Chewing gum, perhaps?
John closed his eyes.
Well, I guess we're screwed then.